Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final Lunch and Learn that we have currently planned, although they've been very successful. So I am sure that we will continue to find opportunities and ways to connect with you all through these opportunities. My name is Pastor Kyle Severson, and I serve as Associate to the Bishop and Director for Candidacy and Mobility here in the Synod. And as I mentioned before, but if you're coming in just now, well, feel free to type your name and your context in the chat. We'd love to know where you're coming from. Just a housekeeping business. If you would keep muted throughout the duration of the presentation, that would be very helpful for us, as this will be recorded and published for later viewing. We will hopefully have time for questions and conversation at the end. If you'd like to place a question in the chat as we go along so you don't forget it, that would be helpful, and we'll try to find a few moments to respond to those. And if not, then we have record of it, and I can try to follow up later on with some answers to that. As we were preparing for today, I was hearing from a number of folks who planned on attending from different constituencies, council members and call committee members who are in the midst of transition, of calling a pastor or a deacon, some who have been recently launched into that process, some who have been in it for a while, from pastors and deacons who are discerning the Spirit leading them to move from their current call and wondering what the process might look like in this administration and in the post-pandemic church. Also, some interim pastors who are preparing their congregations for going through the process, of seminarians who are nearing the completion of their candidacy process and their formation and are interested in the landscape of call opportunities in Metro Chicago Synod. And so I quickly realized that all of these topics and interests would be hard to bring together and cover in a 1-hour webinar, but I hope we'll get the conversation started, and always know that I'm available for conversation following up on this. One thing that I'd like to say that I hope goes without saying, but as our Synod partners, we are praying for each and every one of our congregations to thrive and flourish as communities centered around God's love and grace poured out for all. That being said, we also aren't magicians and can't make things happen out of thin air. We don't create perfect pastors, and we can't fund full-time calls in every congregation. But we are your partners, and we will walk with you and join with you and support you in helping to proclaim the gospel, make disciples, and do justice in the world. I think it's an important aspect to start because it's the heart of what we're about. I've had the opportunity to reflect with people who have been part of this process before, whether on a call committee or otherwise, and they often share this as a really powerful spiritual experience to participate. We believe that God is leading this process, that Christ is the head of the church and the Spirit is actively guiding it. And so we call upon God in prayer every step of the way, as candidates formed for ministry, as pastors discern a call, as the Synod staff prayerfully selects candidates to be part of a slate, as call committees interview and listen for God, as councils and eventually congregations vote in invoking the Spirit's wisdom and guidance, in knowing who we are called to be and where we're called to serve, in shedding personal gain or agenda for the sake of God's will and the good of the church, in rooting ourselves in faith and in trust, in listening and worship and prayer and conversation and deliberation and devotions, in exploring options and skills and gifts and call, in weighing pros and cons, the places where the Spirit seems to open up energy and new paths, in deciding which ways move toward God. I pray that these processes increase your reliance and prayer and the work of communal discernment. upon seeing God work in consensus and in those yes moments. And so I was thinking about a prayer that comes from the breastplate of St. Patrick. Please pray with me. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit, Christ when I stand, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. Amen. Perhaps a little bit of ground setting about our synod. We are a synod of about 170 congregations and worshiping communities in the 4 counties of Cook, Lake, Kane, and DuPage here in Northern Illinois. And we are served by a strong pastoral leadership, as well as some professional leaders who all relate to the call process in some form or fashion. So as I mentioned, I'm Pastor Kyle Severson, and I do overall process support, and I meet with every rostered minister who submits a rostered minister profile to consider a call within our synod, those from within and those from beyond our synod. In addition, I then work with those specific transition and call processes in the North and Near West conferences. And as we've had some transition in the last bit, I have also been working a little bit with the Northeast Conference. Pastor Sunitha Mortha relates to those congregations in the West and Central conferences. Pastor Wivetta Bullock relates to the Southwest Conference. Pastor Kathy Nolte relates to the Northwest and at the moment sharing some of the Northeast Conference, but she'll be taking over that in full as new calls open. And we are enthusiastically waiting to announce our Director for Evangelical Mission and the associate who will work with the South Conference. In the meantime, if you're from the South Conference, feel free to call the Synod office. We all have lots of areas in our portfolio, but central to our work is being present to the congregations in our conferences and accompanying them during the transition. The other thing I just want to note as we get started here is that each of us lead call processes in differently nuanced or slightly different ways and have different expectations or communication styles. So I'll try to speak generally in this presentation, but ultimately the pastoral staff member relating to your conference will lead and guide that. And I do want to introduce another super important person on our staff that relates to many things, but in particular call process, and that's Heather Haynes, who serves as the executive assistant to Bishop Curry. She's the one who deals with the call packets and RMP authorizations and all of those fun aspects. Now to some numbers. Since Bishop Curry took office in September of 2019, there have been 57 congregational calls extended out of 170 congregations, of which 24 were first call candidates and ordained to those positions. I know that we're called to be humble, but I think it's pretty astonishing in a global pandemic that we were able to facilitate these and ensure that we continue to provide faithful leadership for our congregations. The amount of staff time and attention was significant. We continue to pray that these congregations and leaders are building and growing in all the ways that God desires. In terms of the landscape of calls in our synod, again, out of the nearly 170 congregations in our synod, 51 congregations are without a called pastor. Most of these are adequately and faithfully served by interims and contract pastors, synodically authorized ministers, and supply pastors. But a majority of these congregations are unable to provide full-time salary and benefits to a roster of ministers, and therefore we seek different leadership means to serve them. 12 of these congregations are served by synodically authorized ministers who are in the process of becoming ordained pastors as well. So that's an exciting, fruitful leadership formation mechanism that we've been using. There are approximately 19 congregations that are actively moving towards a call at the moment in a variety of different stages. 4 of those would be senior pastor roles in multi-staff congregations, 4 associates in multi-staff congregations, 4 full-time solo pastorates, and 7 part-time pastorates. There are no clear word and service congregational opportunities at the moment. In congregations, deacons can play a pivotal role in faith formation, in music ministry, in outreach, evangelism, and mission. They are seminary trained leaders, and their whole focus is on connecting the church with the world. We hope to continue to see these opportunities grow and flourish. Let us know if that piques your interest for your congregation. And just as a note, whenever I'm using any numbers or statistics in this presentation, they're always a snapshot in a particular moment and changing, but hopefully gives you a little bit of a picture. Largely speaking, we haven't seen the effects of the great resignation, as talked about in the secular workplace, nor even some other synods that are seeing this, particularly in those synods where the COVID-19 pandemic and the political climate have been even more polarizing. However, as we continue to emerge post-pandemic and see the lasting effects on attendance and giving and participation, I am beginning to see more rostered ministers reach out about concerns about the viability of their call and wondering about other opportunities. So we don't see a lot of movement from our pastors, but I guess I am beginning to see a little bit more concern there. Let's talk a little bit about basic call process overview. And when your congregation goes through this process, your pastoral staff will do a far more in-depth process about this. But here's a general timeline. For some reason that is moving and doesn't want to stay on that screen. Let's see if I can fix that. I cannot, but you'll have to just listen for a second then. Basically, the process of a pastor announcing a resignation and meeting with the council to talk about transition and saying goodbye and saying that goodbye well with celebration of the ministry that's been accomplished can take about a month. At that point, we are going to really move into that interim ministry period, which is an ongoing important stage. I'm not going to talk a lot about interim ministry during this presentation. Pastor Wyvetta Bullock already did a webinar on that. I encourage you to go back and watch that if you haven't had the chance yet. But then we'll move into a period of time when it seems appropriate in the midst of that interim ministry to discern mission and ministry goals, to start developing that ministry site profile. The synod staff person will give an orientation to the call committee and the transition team or whomever is helping to develop that site profile. And that could take a process of 6 to 8 weeks to really get listening sessions in the congregation and feedback about what kind of leader is needed next. After the ministry site profile has been activated and your synod staff person meets with you to help that profile come to life a little bit more than just words on a page, we go to the drawing board and begin to prayerfully discern which candidates would be interested in this opportunity and develop that slate of candidates. When we present that to you, It could be 4 to 6 weeks later, depending on the amount of interest, about how quickly we're able to get in communication with pastors and synod offices to get released for consideration and such. Once the slate of candidates is presented to the call committee, it typically takes 30 to 60 days to go through that interview process, depending on how many rounds of interviews, how many candidates are brought to the congregation, and more. If we have to go to another slate of candidates, if all those initial candidates are released and we go to another slate, then we begin that sort of cycle a little bit over again. Once a primary candidate has been selected by the call committee, negotiations about compensation and an introduction with the council, that process takes another 4 weeks or so. A congregational meeting needs to be called and a meet and greet scheduled. That takes another 2 to 4 weeks. The candidate, after the call vote, has up to a month, 30 days to discern whether to accept that call. I rarely see that. We rarely see that, but that is technically possible. And then another 30, 60 days for that candidate to resign from their call that they're currently serving and move before we can do a great welcome and installation. So generally talking about 6 months to a year from resignation, but depending on the circumstances, could extend up to 18 months or longer. You'll see that the ministry side profile, which I've referenced, is this form that the congregation uses to articulate their core values, their gifts and purpose, their leadership needs. Similarly, on the other side, each roster minister has a profile that helps them clarify their calling, their gifts and needs. Those are that we use to make the matches happen. During this time, is it really important for the congregations to continue to map their resources so that we can connect candidates and congregations that will be a good fit for one another and a realistic fit for the next 3+ years. But ultimately, we hope that it's a speedy and fruitful process, bringing together everyone's interests and needs to a successful pastorate. I mentioned again the ministry side profile. It's an online-based form, but there is a sample PDF on the ELCA's website. Who fills that out is different in each context, whether it's the council, a transition team, the call committee. We'll work with you to figure that out, how to most effectively engage the congregation, asking for their priorities. And then that will be submitted online, and we'll meet with you. I think it's really important to highlight that the MSP is not the goal of the interim or transition period. The goal is to discern your mission, to have faithful reflection and planning of knowing who you are and how God can use your congregation in this time and place. Where is your energy? What resources and gifts do you have already present in the congregation? And then what do you need in a leader to help bring you forward? The MSP helps communicate with the synod and potential roster ministers, but it's not the end goal. It's just our way of communication. Other important things that have been crucial for our administration is the development of a couple trainings and documents. One is the Pathways Conversation, particularly for those congregations who have questions about their ongoing sustainability and vitality. But increasingly, every congregation in this post-pandemic reality, we're encouraging congregations to talk about various pathways to sustainability. That might look like transformation through mission planning, but it could also look like partnership by sharing pastors or staffing arrangements. It could look like discerning a legacy through closure and releasing those assets for those places where there is new energy and new ideas. But additionally, through the work that Pastor Sunitha Mortha has been doing around diversity, inclusion, and belonging, we're increasingly finding ways to work with call committees and congregations on understanding and interrupting implicit bias. That is those subconscious processes in our brain that unknowingly write off who may or may not be called and gifted to be your next pastor without even being able to listen deeply to their story. And similarly, I think with roster ministers who may write off congregations in particular settings with certain populations without even getting to know them. These have been important strategic aspects of the call process of recent. Other important sort of norms or considerations in this particular synod. After prayerful consideration, the synod staff generally provides a slate of 3 candidates to interview. And we've done a lot of prayerful consideration in this, and so we asked our congregations to do initial interviews with all 3 of those candidates as much as possible, because there's so much more to be learned from an interview than just from a piece of paper, that roster minister profile. We generally place first call candidates and experienced candidates right alongside each other in a slate. Some synods, if they're going with the first call person, they only give a first call person and no experienced pastors, or the opposite. We find that having conversation with both kinds of candidates when possible is life-giving for call committees. It's important to realize that rostered ministers are likely in multiple call processes in multiple synods. This is good for their discernment, just as it's good for you to be in conversation with multiple candidates. It's good for candidates to be in conversation with multiple settings. And those roster ministers then are interviewing you as much as you are interviewing them. So the interviews and the way in which we go about hospitality and a variety of different things related to call should be really sensitive to both parties doing interviewing. One thing some congregations forget is that there might be budget needs related to interviews and site visits, moving expenses, those kinds of realities. So if you are going into a call process in the coming year and still working on your budget, it could be really helpful to include some of that in the budget for the coming year. Of course, typically there is a provision in our constitutions that allows for council to spend a certain amount that's not in the budget related to this, but could be a helpful planning tool if you're going into this coming year. The other reality is that there is so much more content available about rostered ministers online than there ever was before. So preaching visits, for example, where a call committee shows up in the congregation that the pastor currently serves and listens to a sermon and observes them in action, really has diminished. Part of that is because our worshiping communities are smaller and have far more protections, or for a while we were doing contact tracing and a variety of things, and so it was really difficult for a call committee to quietly show up in a context and not be noticed. But on the other hand, online, they have mostly every sermon that they've been given, and writings and Bible studies and things that you would have access to. And so it's kind of changed the way and the access with which call committees can see a pastor in action. So that's been helpful and just different. And so if you are a roster minister and going into this process, know that that stuff is likely going to be viewed. Your everyday sermon, not just the hand-selected sermon that you want them to see, will be available. When we talk about developing a slate of candidates, people ask, where are the sources of these candidates? And there are 5 major sources. One is the rostered minister database. These are the folks that have discerned that they're open to a new call and submit their paperwork for consideration. If I were to click into that database I looked up the numbers again yesterday, revised them for yesterday. There were 52 ministers of word and sacrament who have preferenced Metro Chicago Synod from across the ELCA. There were 2 ministers of word and service. These are deacons that have preference to Metro Chicago Synod. And then we have, again, and we'll talk about first call in a second a little bit more, but we have 3 first call candidates for word and sacrament that can be considered, and 4 first call candidates for word and service. For comparison's sake, though, when we move to pastors willing to accept a part-time call, that 59 moves to 14. And these numbers are also just pure data, not commentary on gifts and past experiences and bishop recommendations and other important factors that we take a look at. Also, a good number of these folks have been in the system for a while, and some of them may already have received a call or are in final stages of that process. And several of them have checked all the synods of the ELCA and don't necessarily have a particular interest in coming to our synod, coming to Metro Chicago. So some of that discernment has to be figured out along the way as well. The second source of candidates is the ELCA database and the Metro Chicago vacancy list. So on the 2 websites, the one for the ELCA and the one for our synod, there are places in which we post call vacancies. In our synod, you can't really see this, but the second heading over here says 4 leaders. If you hover over it and go down to current call opportunities, you click there and it takes you to a page that lists those call processes that we are actively moving towards a call in, those 19, for example, that I mentioned earlier. It will have a designation about what stage in the process they are in, whether they are just beginning the call process or whether they have posted their MSP or whether they're interviewing candidates already or wherever on the journey. On the ELCA's website, elca.org, up here on the top right corner, you'll see that there's an option, say, call process. You click up there. It will take you to this current openings page, and you can click down and find all of the vacancies here in Metro Chicago that have an active ministry site profile. So congregations who their pastor just resigned, we've just gotten started on the interim process, they won't show up here on this website yet. They don't show up until the ministry site profile has been posted and activated. So for example, this list has about 19 congregations. This has 6 active ministry site profiles right in this moment. A third source of candidates, which doesn't happen frequently, but is a possibility, is that you as a congregational leader may know of a quality pastor you want to be considered. You fill out a congregational nomination form and we'll do the work here in the office. We do the work of reaching out to their bishop if they're in another synod, to reach out to them to ask if they're interested in moving on. These folks often don't have a ministry site or roster minister profile active yet, so they need to do some work to get that going if they do desire to be part of the process. The fourth is that we as a synod staff or Bishop Curry would know of a pastor that would be a good fit and invite them to consider to be part of the process. We all know the gifts and skills of a lot of our pastors, and as well as the needs of our congregations, and then invite them into consideration. And finally, it is that first call consultation. We have a process for ensuring that all areas of this church receive new ministers. And so first call pastors or deacons are assigned to work with just one particular synod. They're not eligible to just seek a call anywhere. And so on a quarterly basis in this region, approximately February, July, October, some of those other dates get mixed in there. Sometimes it's in May and then August and a variety of times. But we get another round or a batch of candidates to consider for calls. So there are sometimes congregations are like, oh, if we're thinking about a first call, do we need to have our paper in at a very specific time, like at the end of graduation or whatever. And the answer is that many folks do their internship at the final year of their seminary journey these days. And so they end at various times. And there are these 4 different points throughout the year that we get new candidates. It doesn't necessarily align with every May, for example. So those are the ways and means in which we acquire names and do this consideration. And then we meet as a synod staff every Tuesday as a pastoral staff to talk about our vacancies, to talk about ideas of candidates, to help discern who might be a good fit. Moving a bit now to those roster ministers on the call who are discerning a new call. What do you do? First, I encourage you to reach out to the associates of the bishop for your current conference. Let them know that you're discerning a call, thinking of moving on. Reach out to me as the Director for Candidacy and Mobility. I want to know about the context in which you think you will thrive, the particular non-negotiables for your life and family, to think about your gifts and skills and where you're being called for this next season of your life. You'll submit your roster minister profile. You can either do that before you have conversation with me or after. Frequently check out those vacancy lists on our website and on the ELCA website, and reach out when you see something of interest. Often when there is a possibility or you express interest in a congregation, I'll invite you to review the ministry side profile and then share with me those areas of alignment between their goals and visions and your gifts and skills and experience. And then we'll use that information as we discern the slate of candidates to submit to the congregation, and then as part of your introduction to them. Thought it'd be helpful for you to think about the sort of candidates that are coming up through the process. Generally, the process for formation for pastors is a 4-year journey through candidacy, and for deacons, generally a 2-year process if folks are moving full-time through schoolwork and for contextual education and all of that. Currently here in Metro Chicago, we have about 55 candidates going through this process. We are preparing leaders for the whole church, not just here for Metro Chicago. So some of those 55 will stay locally, but some of them will be released for service in the church broadly. But some identity pieces about these 55 candidates. About 55% of the 55 candidates are female, identify as female. 35% are male, and about 10% identify as trans or non-binary or gender fluid. About 30% of our candidates are people of color or whose primary language is other than English. And about 25% of our candidates identify as LGBTQIA+. We have been blessed richly with diversity of candidates who have discerned God's call to ministry. Diversity that is not seen broadly in a lot of other synods. And so we give thanks to God that that has happened here for us. But we also know then that there have been differences in wait times for call processes. So just a survey and statistics that was developed by the ELCA. I think the survey was in 2021, but this is a graph that shows the differences of wait time by race and ethnicity. And if you compound gender and sexuality on top of these or lay those on top of each other, you see even more interesting findings. But generally, they found that there's no overall gender differences and only slight differences based on graduation period. They wanted to see then what race and ethnicity might have on that. They found that women of color experience longer wait times for their calls than other groups, that roster ministers of color are twice as likely to experience wait times of 24 months or more compared to white ministers, and that white ministers, regardless of gender, are significantly more likely to experience the shortest wait times, that being less than 4 months. You still can see here for all of the sort of demographics, about 45% or more receive a call within that first 1 to 4 months of ordination, with significant lower portions for women of color and men of color, as you can see. And then as you go farther on, men in color and women of color experience larger wait times there. This is why, for example, the work around implicit bias has been so important and such a priority for Bishop Curry and our administration. And so a lot of folks say that there's a clergy shortage, and there is, in some degrees, a shortage of pastors who are able to consider for their life experience a part-time call. And also, we know that there are lots of people who are sitting waiting for a call opportunity for a congregation to lift them up and say, yes, we want them to be our pastor. So in addition to the implicit bias training and other ways of engaging, we share this document called Enrich and Transform with our call committees and councils when possible. It was developed by a para-church organization called Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries, but it helps frame the conversation and questions and vocabulary, and help bring a little comfort to call committees in knowing how to appropriately have conversation and do the self-reflection needed to welcome the gifts of LGBTQ people into their process. With that, I think we are able to move to some questions. I know that was a lot of information, rapid fire, but if you have questions that you think would be broad enough of interest for a majority of the listeners here. If you have specific process questions related to your congregation or your candidacy or ministry, feel free to reach out to your pastoral staff member or to me. But are there some general, broader questions? And I have not been watching the chat, Heather, so if there is anything there.
No questions in the chat.
Awesome, thanks.
I do have a question.
Wonderful.
I don't understand. Well, could you clarify the difference between the words, the terms were used, word and sacrament and word and service, and what does that mean and how does that impact the call process?
Thank you. So ministers of word and sacrament is the sort of technical word for pastor in our church. So ministers of word and sacrament primarily express God's grace and love through sacramental means, presiding over baptism and Holy Communion and other church functions in that way. Our ministers of word and service, are termed deacons in our church, and the expression we use often is connecting the church with the world. And so they're often in ministries or social service settings or parachurch organizations or chaplaincy or a variety of different ways of doing that work of connecting church and world, expressing God's love and grace through preaching, but rather than sacramental means of service and evangelism and mission and those things. So generally speaking, our congregations reach out to us when they're in need of a pastor, someone to lead the congregation, preside over worship, and do those functions. But we definitely have a number of congregations, or at least a handful of congregations, who have deacons on staff who serve in the areas of administration and music and worship and evangelism and outreach and those areas. But they wouldn't be the ones that would preside over the Eucharist on a Sunday morning.
Karen has a question. Is the online viewing of sermons replacing completely the watching of pastors preach, or would we still be able to view a pastor in action live?
I would say a good majority of the processes that have happened in the last 3 years, it has completely replaced the actual going to the congregation and viewing, or bringing the pastor on site, or finding a neutral congregation to observe, because folks have felt like they've gotten far more content than they ever have received before, and more than depending on their decision based on one instance, one glimpse into a sermon, they've gotten to view 20 sermons and feel like they really have, and church services, not just the sermons for that matter. And they felt like they've gotten even more information that they would have gotten before. If there's a particular need or a reason why we would want to do that, we would work with you to, again, either find a way that it wouldn't obstruct their ministry in their current setting, or find a neutral congregation for the preaching and worship leadership to happen. I see another question here. When the Senate provides a call team with the names of 3 candidates, is it the expectation that all 3 candidates receive an interview? Is it the expectation that all 3 candidates must be released before the call team receives additional candidates to review and interview? So here we'll talk about norms for sure. In the processes that I lead, again, each pastoral staff has a slightly different style, but the process I lead, so much I communicate that there's so much prayer and work that is done to bring this slate of candidates together, that I expect my congregations to have an initial interview with each of the 3 candidates. There's so much more learned from that interview than what's on the rostered minister's profile. And it is the expectation that all 3 candidates be released before you get an additional slate. We have found that when there's an openness and you keep holding on to one, but then want more names, and then you want more names, and you want more names, there's this inability to truly go deep and listen and reflect about, is this person called to be our next pastor? What is being what's the concern that's holding you back from calling that person to be your pastor or deacon, that isn't giving you the confidence to move forward with that one? So by having to really wrestle with what's at the heart of this one, why are we unwilling to release this one candidate? Sometimes that gives you the permission needed and soul searching needed, or communal discernment to extend a call, then move forward in the process with that one person, or to say, no, there's something really holding us back and we have serious concerns about some aspect. And so to release that and then move forward with a new slate. Any other questions? These are great. If not, then I will lead us in a closing prayer. As we anticipate the Feast of Epiphany tomorrow, I'm thinking about all the ways in which we're on a journey. Although I just see a question come in. When the congregation has had a senior and an assistant pastor and the senior pastor leaves, how does the congregation go through the process of calling the assistant to be the new senior pastor? So this is one of the times in which Thank you. That reminded me of something I meant to mention before about the slate of 3 candidates. There are exceptions to when we don't provide 3 candidates. Sometimes there's a reason why we provide 4 candidates or 5 candidates in very limited situations. There's also times in which we offer less than 3. And one of those is when there's already a synodically authorized minister serving the congregation, and the intent is then to call them as pastor. Another is when there's a circumstance where, for example, an assistant or associate pastor is being considered for senior pastor. And then we go through discernment with Bishop Curry and the pastoral staff and the congregation to discern, is this a closed process in which that candidate is the only candidate to be considered, sort of an up-down vote of calling them to be the next lead pastor or senior pastor, or if that candidate will be in consideration amongst other candidates. And that's a really contextual decision based on what Bishop Curry is hearing and seeing and what the pastoral staff discerns. So there are sort of 2 pathways forward when this happens. And like I said, one path is that they're the only candidate considered. They're interviewed by the call committee, recommended to the council, and then go to a congregational vote. And there are other times when they are considered amongst a slate of other candidates to prayerfully discern. But with that, moving towards Epiphany, we're all on journeys, and on call processes and transitions are important, vulnerable journeys. And so a prayer that comes to my mind often is the Holden journey prayer. That's also included in our Cranberry ELW hymnals. And so if you would pray with me. Oh God, you have called your servants to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, by paths as yet untrodden, through perils unknown. Give us faith to go out with good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us and your love supporting us. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you so much. Again, please feel free to reach out to the associate to the bishop that works with your congregation and conference, or to me. Happy to stay on if a few folks have a few more questions, but thanks so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to walk alongside of you.